Now our topic is critical thinking about evidence and practice. It's important to acknowledge that there are diverse worldviews and different ways of knowing. So we talk about paradigms or different worldviews as including various assumptions about the nature of reality, the nature of knowledge, and different methods for developing knowledge. In terms of ways of knowing about the world, we rely on tradition, that is, information that's handed down to us in our families, communities, cultures, religions, tribes. We also learn from authority figures, parents, teachers, elders, mentors, leaders, experts. And we learn about the world through our own intuition, our own senses, our feelings, our everyday experience, in which we observe what happens to us and to others as a result of action or inaction. And we learn about the world through science, scientific methods. Now this course, of course, will focus mostly on science, but that's not because scientific methods are inherently better or worse than other ways of knowing. They are different, and they do try to compensate for some of the problems or issues that arise in other ways of knowing. To do this, they require two things: logic or reason and empirical evidence, which is information obtained through systematic observation. So we will be talking a lot about logic and evidence in this course. And one question that we'll spend some time answering over the next few weeks is what counts as good evidence? Here are a couple of preliminary answers to that question. On the left, this quote from William Bruce Cameron is often attributed to Einstein incorrectly, but Cameron said that not everything that can be counted counts or matters, and not everything that counts, not everything that matters, can be counted. So quantification is not a goal here. And you see on the right why that is. Here, someone has attempted to quantify various attributes of a community: its population, its altitude, and the year in which it was established. Now those are fine qualities of a community, but adding them up makes absolutely no sense. So these are not, this is not good evidence. In the literature now, we see a lot of hierarchies of evidence that suggest that some forms of research produce more reliable and valid, credible and trustworthy kinds of evidence or knowledge for use in policy and practice. And here's a typical hierarchy of evidence that suggests that systematic reviews of existing research and meta-analysis, which is the statistical combination of data collected from multiple studies, provides the best source of evidence. Next to that are randomized controlled trials or experiments aimed at assessing the effects of interventions. Third, we have cohort studies, which are longitudinal studies that follow people over time. Fourth are case control studies in which different groups are compared to each other. Fifth are cross-sectional surveys in which data are gathered at one point in time. And then finally we have case studies or case reports. Okay, now one problem here is that we see many variations on this theme in the literature. There are lots of pyramids of evidence, hierarchies of evidence. Let's take a look at the pyramid on the right because it makes some interesting distinctions between filtered information and unfiltered information. And here the idea is that some information is filtered by hopefully independent observers. So in a systematic review, you have a team of reviewers who are assessing the qualities and credibility of a body of research. So that's why systematic reviews are put at the top of the pyramid, because that information is filtered by independent observers. There are other kinds of filtered information. Sometimes topics are critically appraised. Sometimes individual studies are critically appraised. So in this schema, the authors prefer filtered information to unfiltered information, And unfiltered information refers to individual studies. So for example, randomized controlled trials conducted and reported by a set of authors, and other kinds of studies that have not been filtered or appraised by independent observers are in the middle of the pyramid. Now, one of the problems with these hierarchies of evidence is that they use inconsistent criteria. And to illustrate this point, here you have two somewhat simplified hierarchies of evidence based on study designs next to each other. And the one on the left has 5 levels, the one on the right has 7. They have different starting points. The one on the left begins with what they call well-conducted, suitably powered, that means large, randomized controlled trials. And their second level is also about randomized controlled trials, but these are smaller trials. And then other types of study designs. The hierarchy on the right has a different starting point, beginning with systematic reviews and meta-analysis. Then 2 levels of randomized controlled trials, but the distinction between these 2 levels is different. Here they're distinguishing randomized controlled trials not based on how they're conducted or how large they are, but based on their results, whether the results are definitive or not. So that's confusing. Here's another evidence pyramid for practice, and this one provides some interesting lessons, I think, for us. It begins with the traditional pyramid shown in picture A, and then it does a couple of things to that pyramid. First, these authors, Murad and colleagues, draw wavy lines between the different types of studies, suggesting that different types of studies are not inherently better or worse than others, but there are other factors that determine the quality and credibility of research. So, for example, randomized controlled trials are not inherently better than cohort studies. We can have well-designed and poorly designed trials, and well-designed and poorly designed cohort studies. So the wavy lines suggest that some cohort studies might actually be better than some randomized controlled trials. Okay, I think that's a step in the right direction. The next step here, I should say that this wavy lines idea comes from the grade system for evaluating evidence, which says we shouldn't rely only on these study design labels. We should look more carefully at how studies are conducted. Okay, then second, the authors chop systematic reviews and perhaps other sources of filtered evidence off the pyramid and say that these are really lenses through which the evidence should be viewed. I think that's useful. Just for fun, here's another hierarchy of evidence. This is from a policymaker's point of view. Phil Davies worked in the UK Home Office, which is like the US Department of Health and Human Services. And he puts forth this hierarchy of evidence to suggest what matters to policymakers. And he says that policymakers rely most heavily on experts. The consultants they hire and other think tanks that they respect are thought to provide the best evidence. And second, they consider strong opinions presented to them by lobbyists and pressure groups, because those opinions are clear. Third, they rely on ideology developed by party think tanks, platforms, and manifestos. Fourth, they are influenced by the media, including the internet. Fifth, they're influenced by lay evidence, their constituents' and citizens' experience. They also are aware of and may be influenced by street evidence, urban myths, conventional wisdom. They take with a grain of salt, but can be influenced by cabbies' evidence, the evidence of our Uber drivers, taxi drivers. And last comes research. Now, Phil Davies is himself a researcher and policymaker, but he's presenting this hierarchy to suggest that from many points of view, research is really the last step, that we are using evidence that is in some ways filtered by others, cabbies, myths, citizens, etc., and that research is actually fairly inaccessible to policymakers. Also for fun, Rick Barth developed this solidness of evidence scale, which is supposed to represent the certainty of evidence. And he suggests that we would like to have rock-solid evidence, a solid foundation for understanding an intervention that is not likely to shift over time, that that's unrealistic. There is no rock-solid evidence. Second, we might have evidence that's based on sort of gravel. It's not stable, but it forms a decent foundation for our work. Relying on sand, evidence that's likely to shift over time, gets a little more risky. And then we have water. It might float some ideas for a while, but in the long run, programs that are built on water are likely to sink. And finally, he suggests that there's some evidence that is really just gaseous. It's hot air or worse. Okay, let's take a more pragmatic approach. In a useful article, now more than 10 years old, called Paradigms Lost and Pragmatism Regained, Morgan argued that social research does not have to be embedded in a single worldview. We don't have to subscribe to a neatly defined paradigm to do research. But instead, a practical, pragmatic approach is useful to answer many questions. So we can use multiple perspectives drawn from different worldviews. We can use multiple methods in any given study or inquiry. And this use of mixed methods has real advantages because each method can offset the limitations of another method. We'll be talking about some examples of this in the future. This is an approach that's sometimes called methodological pluralism. And it means that the best research method depends on what questions we're asking. And this really calls into question the wisdom of things like hierarchies of evidence. Because if we're focused on the question, that should determine what kinds of method we prefer, what kind of evidence we want. So again, methodological pluralism, meaning the best research methods depend on what questions we are asking. This is illustrated here, I think, fairly nicely by Pettigrew and Roberts. And here they're showing us different types of questions that could be asked and answered. In this case, this is referring to social interventions for children. So on the left, you have different kinds of questions. On the right, you have different kinds of studies providing different types of evidence. If our question is about effectiveness, does an intervention work? Does it work better than something else? Then we're going to be looking for randomized controlled trials because they produce the best evidence of cause and effect. And we'll be looking for systematic reviews of those trials to see if that evidence holds up over time and over multiple studies. We might use evidence from cohort studies, that is longitudinal studies, or so-called quasi-experiments, which we'll talk about later, but that evidence is a little weaker. And then you also see there's some forms of evidence that really don't answer that question at all. So by itself, a survey isn't going to definitively answer the question about effectiveness. On the other hand, if we're interested in the process of service delivery, how does this program work? What happens here? We're more likely to use qualitative research to understand the lived experience of children in this intervention. What happens to them? What are their views? We might use survey data to gather data on attitudes, opinions, experiences. But we're not going to use randomized controlled trials because that's irrelevant to understand how a program works. We might use systematic reviews if they are syntheses of studies of the process of service delivery. So, take a look at these different kinds of questions and just use this as sort of a starting point. You don't need to study this chart real carefully, but it does suggest ways of matching questions and methods, research methods. Again, the best research methods depend on our questions. That's a main theme in this course. And over the next few weeks, we will develop a typology of research questions that are relevant for our practice and examine the types of logic and evidence and the research needed to answer specific kinds of questions. Let me give you a very brief and incomplete history of research in social work, just to give you a sense of how some of this work has evolved over the last 120 years. There's a wonderful book by Zimbalist that chronicles the evolution of research in social work and social welfare from the early 1900s on. And Zimbalist identifies some enduring themes in this work, along with some passing fads and lessons to be taken from the work over time. The enduring themes that appear again and again in the social work research literature are interest in understanding the causes of poverty, health, mental health, and well-being, concern about multi-problem families or complex biopsychosocial problems, interest in accurately measuring and understanding problems and conditions like poverty and mental health, interest in assessing community needs, and interest in assessing or testing the effects of interventions. In addition, Zimbalist notes that from time to time we have engaged in passing fads, and we've been overly enthusiastic about a particular approach that didn't work too well in the long run. And some examples are that sort of early in our history we embraced simplistic linear models of cause and effect to explain things like poverty or effects of intervention. And those simplistic linear models, one thing leads to another, just simply don't work very well to explain complex human behavior and social environments. We also demonstrated at an early point in our history over-reliance on surveys. And here the assumption was that we would collect a lot of data and the data would speak for itself. Well, data never speaks for itself. So the data really need to be developed in a theoretical context, and interpretation and analysis are not value-free. So some of the lessons that come away from this brief history are that we need more complex models of causal mechanisms, more rigorous studies of intervention effects, and clearer foci to guide the collection and interpretation of data. Then in the 1970s, Reed and others developed and tested a scientist-practitioner model of social work. In this model, clinical social workers would collect data on their clients and evaluate their own practice. But social service agencies didn't support this. They didn't give clinicians the time or resources to do this. Then there was a series of studies on the effects of social work and related interventions that came to different conclusions. For example, in a very famous paper published in 1973, Joel Fisher asked, "Is casework effective?" And his answer was no. But his critics suggested that he had framed the question poorly. This is a bad question. Casework is not a singular approach. It means many different things. And Fisher didn't specify the kinds of problems that were relevant. He included studies that addressed a wide range of problems. He didn't specify the kinds of outcomes that were important. He reviewed any kind of research on the effects of anything that looked like a casework intervention. So, of course, the results were all over the place. Then there was an important study by Leonard Bickman et al. Called the Fort Bragg study that looked at whether more services and better service coordination improve outcomes. And the answer to that question appears to be no. More is not necessarily better. So from these two lines of work, we learn that intervention by itself is not necessarily effective. You have to ask that question more carefully about what works best for whom. And more is not better. Coordination of services is not necessarily effective. More recently, there's been an emphasis on branded interventions, or programs that are hopefully well-defined or have manuals to guide their implementation, versus common elements of effective intervention. So these branded interventions, I'll talk about more in a minute, are sometimes called evidence-based practices, and there are some people who really think we should identify and test and promote effective practices, and others who think we should be looking at the important components or ingredients that may be common to practices that make them effective. So now we talk a lot about evidence-based practice, and I'm going to suggest to you that there are two very different approaches to this problem. That first, evidence-based practice, as it was originally defined, is a process of decision-making that's driven by clinicians and others. And this idea comes from evidence-based medicine, which was defined by Sackett and Strauss and their colleagues as the conscientious, explicit, judicious use of best available evidence to make decisions about individual cases. So you see here the driver of this is the clinician who's using evidence to make decisions about a case. And this model's been adapted for social work practice by Leonard Gibbs and for social policy by Phil Davies. In contrast, we also talk about evidence-based practices, plural, as a set of effective interventions. So these are the practices, programs, or policies that are thought to meet certain criteria or standards of evidence. In this approach, we get lists of effective or so-called effective programs that are transported or widely disseminated, often with financial incentives. So let's take a look at the first approach, this process. As articulated by Strauss and colleagues, evidence-based practice has 5 steps. We begin by asking an answerable question. We then acquire relevant evidence, appraise the qualities of that evidence, apply the evidence in our case or program or practice, and assess the results. Assessing the results leads to new questions and so on. But that's the process of evidence-based practice. And it suggests that policy and practice are informed by many types of evidence, qualitative, quantitative, and even sometimes anecdotal evidence on a variety of topics. So for instance, we need to know what our program or service provider is trying to accomplish. What are the goals of this intervention? And what do we value? What are we trying to achieve? We need to know what our clients need and what they prefer. And if I'm a clinician and I'm interested in getting evidence about what my client's preferences are, I will accept anecdotal evidence from her on that topic. That's just fine. That's all I need. But also to make decisions, wise decisions in practice and policy, we need to know something about what our practitioners know and what they can do. We also need evidence about the resources and constraints under which we work. These are legal and ethical constraints, financial resources, and we need information about intervention effects. Now, the discussion of evidence-based practice has focused too much, in my opinion, on this last topic, intervention effects. And in fact, we need information about all of these topics in order to make wise decisions. And evidence isn't enough to guide decisions. We need to consider the values of our service providers and our clients, preferences, resources, ethics, and legal constraints. So evidence is just one piece of information for decision-making and practice. It's an important piece, and it's the one we'll focus on here, but evidence alone does not drive action. The other approach has been to identify evidence-based practices plural. And here, criteria for evaluating treatment effects have been developed by government and professional organizations and also by meta-analysts. And different criteria have been applied to bodies of evidence to determine what works. Results are used to create lists of so-called effective or model programs. Evidence-based practice is plural. So for example, Blueprints for Violence Prevention is a very prestigious group based in Colorado that identifies promising and model programs. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration had a program that identified promising, effective, and model interventions, recently discontinued under our current administration. The Society for Prevention Research has standards for efficacy, that means effectiveness under ideal conditions, effectiveness and dissemination of interventions. And the most influential scheme is one developed by the American Psychological Association's Division 12, which is the clinical psychology division. They identify probably efficacious and well-established treatments. And to meet one of those categories, an intervention has to have at least 2 randomized controlled trials showing evidence of positive effects. Now, there could be 20 other randomized controlled trials showing no effects, but that doesn't always matter. So let's contrast these 2 approaches. Evidence-based practice is a bottom-up process in which case decisions are informed by evidence and other considerations. Evidence-based practices involves this top-down effort to widely implement so-called effective program models. I ask whether these 2 approaches are even compatible, and Leonard Gibbs said they're not. Leonard Gibbs said, as soon as you make the term evidence-based practice plural, you've changed the subject. Because one is a process driven by clinicians, and the other is a top-down attempt to implement some approaches. You can tell which one I prefer, but in any case, no matter what you or others prefer, both approaches rely on research and research synthesis. So research synthesis is the combination of results from multiple studies, and it provides more compelling evidence than results of any single study, because multiple studies enhance our confidence in the results, place the results of any single study in context, and give us opportunities to investigate what works best for whom, under what conditions, we have a more nuanced question, and why outcomes might vary across studies, populations, interventions, and measures. So research synthesis gives us an opportunity to dig deeper into the questions that individual studies asked. So here are some assumptions that I am making about the problems that we face here. I'm assuming that there are large bodies of knowledge that are not available to us. There are many things we don't know. There is also a lot of information out there, misinformation that is or is not available to us. And I'm assuming that some of our own beliefs are not correct, and that we are not aware of these inaccuracies. We don't know what we don't know. So what? Well, this is really important. We don't know everything. We have misinformation, and some of our assumptions are incorrect. Important because we should not act on or relay misinformation. This is not in our client's interest. It's not in our interest. And in thinking about this idea of misinformation and uncertainty, I'm thinking, what do we do to improve our knowledge, to develop our knowledge? And here are some suggestions, and these are things we're going to explore in this course. We can build understanding of meta-research, which is research that shows us how research is conducted and what to believe, what to be cautious about. We can build our understanding of logic. What is good logic? And what are some logical fallacies that we often make? We can build understanding of common cognitive biases or mistakes that we make in perception, and understand research methods, which are explicitly aimed to either understand or correct our biases and errors, and also understand empirical evidence, critically appraise research findings. We can also embrace this idea of uncertainty, the idea that we make assumptions and they're not all correct. We need to question the assumptions that we make about what is and is not true. It helps to admit our ignorance and uncertainty as well as our knowledge. This is an idea that Eileen Gambrell, a famous social work scholar, has developed very well. She says it's important to be as aware of our ignorance as it is to be aware of our knowledge, because awareness of gaps in our knowledge gives us an important starting point for learning. So we want to embrace this idea of not knowing, that gives us humility and keeps us open-minded. Knowledge and uncertainty are important here. And this made me think about this famous quote from Donald Rumsfeld. As we know, there are known knowns. These are the things we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, there are some things, spelled wrong, that we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know. And that's really very interesting. We don't know what it is that we don't know. Well, just for fun, I was so intrigued with this quote because it's been often repeated. I actually went to look for the source and I found it. I found the transcript from this, I guess it was a news briefing. And here it is, so that you can see exactly how Rumsfeld said this. And I think the context is really interesting. Sorry, this is a tangent, but I had a little fun here. So Rumsfeld is asked to talk about this assertion that there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And he's asked, is there any evidence of this? And he gives this, answer about known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. It's really kind of evasive, although it's been a very influential quote. And then he's asked, well, is this idea of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, is this an unknown unknown? And he refuses to say. So that's misleading. So why does all of this matter? It matters more than ever now in combating what are now called alternative facts and other forms of misinformation, such as the assertion that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But closer to home, here are some beliefs that I hear from social workers sometimes that appear, at least to me, to be demonstrably false. So there's this belief that the MMR vaccine causes autism. That is demonstrably not true. Another belief that homeopathy is an effective treatment for multiple ailments. And here the theory is that water remembers where it's been. So if you have a very small amount of some substance in water, the water remembers that. And a highly diluted remedy can be effective. I'm sorry, that's not true. I don't think. A third belief that appears to me to be false is this idea that the right and left hemispheres of the brain have different functions. We hear this all the time, right brain, left brain, but there's a very good meta-analysis that shows this is incorrect. So, again, there are widespread myths, beliefs that are incorrect. And I want to challenge you to think about what are some other beliefs that you are acquainted with that you think are not true. So one of the ways in which we learn is from experience, and that experience means trial and error. And the error is not itself a problem. Failure is not a problem. My friend and colleague Howard White notes that businesses fail all the time. In fact, most startups fail. 75% of all restaurants fail in the first year. And why is failure seen as a problem, particularly in nonprofit organizations? It's not a problem. Mistakes are not a problem. It's the failure to learn from failure that is the problem. And sort of related to that, here's a nice little quote that we make progress only when we stick our neck out, but that's risky. I want to make sure that you understand how I'm using these terms in this course, because these are sort of important sort of building blocks of what we'll do this semester. So I'm using the term evidence very broadly to include any information that is provided to support an assertion, a statement. So that evidence could be anecdotal, that evidence could certainly be incorrect. Any information provided to support an assertion. Now, defining it broadly gives us a lot of latitude to think about what is and is not credible evidence, given a particular question. And in this context, an assertion is a claim about knowledge or truth. We know something that works, we know something is true. On its own, it doesn't have evidence. You need evidence to support it. So we have this phenomenon called reasoning by assertion, which is a problem. where people make a chain of assertions, a chain of claims with no basis in evidence. I know this is true, therefore that is true, therefore this other thing is true. That's reasoning by assertion with no evidence. Now, an inference is a conclusion, any kind of conclusion, based on evidence and reasoning. So it's often an if-then statement. If a program improves client outcomes and does no harm, then we say it's effective. So here, an inference, we're going to talk about different kinds of inference, but it's, again, based on evidence and reasoning, so now we're using these building blocks of scientific methods, logic and evidence. I want to talk about sort of different approaches to science here. So again, I've said that science is based on logic and empirical evidence, but there's some variations on this theme. Pseudoscience is something we'll talk a lot about in this class. Pseudoscience is something that looks like science but is not. It's often used to promote a product, an agenda, or a point of view, or maybe a social service program. In our culture, science sells, or has until at least recently, that many people are persuaded by scientific sounding arguments. On the other hand, there are problems with scientism, which is an overemphasis on the rigid or literal aspects of science, so overdoing methods and treating science as a religion, really. And then, of course, there is anti-science, which is the belief that scientific knowledge is invalid or useless. And we see this, for example, in climate change denial. Let's think about how research and practice relate. So what are the roles of research in social work practice? Now here again, I'm using the term practice very broadly to include clinical practice, agency practice, management, and policy analysis and development. So practice at any level. Research can be useful to inform our assessments of clients or community problems. It can be used to build knowledge of social problems or conditions. It can inform clients or systems about relevant conditions and interventions. So, and we as social workers sometimes may serve as knowledge brokers. When clients or colleagues ask us what we know about various conditions or programs, or interventions, we often are asked to broker knowledge. Research can inform the development and selection of interventions, that is, practices, programs, or policies. And what are the roles of practice in research? Well, practice experience and practice wisdom contributes to the development of priorities for research. Practitioners are often in the best position to suggest what it is that research should focus on, what questions are important. And practice contributes to the development of key concepts, main ideas for research. So sort of fleshing out ideas, explaining what is important and what these things mean in practice is really a useful starting point for research. Following that, practice contributes to the development of key questions, hypotheses, and theory for research. What questions should we be asking? How should we be framing those questions? What are the hypotheses under which people are operating? And what theoretical bases do we have for understanding current practice and policy? How should those theories be assessed empirically? Importantly, practitioners can contribute to the interpretation of research findings. So research does not occur in a vacuum, and practice wisdom, practice experience can be enormously useful in helping researchers understand what the results mean and what to do next. Okay, this is a worksheet I'd like you to work up for next time. So what I'd like you to do is describe some assertions or beliefs that you have. Make a knowledge claim. And then describe how you know this. Look at our first slide about ways of knowing. Do you know this through tradition, from some experts, from your own experience? And how certain or confident are you in this knowledge? And here just say things like very certain, not sure, or completely unsure? And what questions remain? What don't you know about this topic? What would you like to know? And I'm asking you to do this for several different topics. So describe a client or social problem that you care about. And then again, what do you know? How do you know it? How sure are you? What don't you know? Pick some kind of rate or trend in a problem or condition. Is something increasing, decreasing over time? How do you know? What about some kind of relationship, a correlate or association or a risk or protective factor? Identify a relevant intervention, something interesting to you. What do you know about it? How do you know? And so on. And make a statement about an intervention effects. What effects do you think an intervention has? So let's do that for next time, and we'll talk about it in class, and we'll work on refining these questions. And then finally, I want to ask you to please provide anonymous feedback. There's a place for this on Moodle at the end of each segment for each class section. There's an opportunity for you to say what was most useful and least useful about each class session, and that can refer to the resources that we have or our use of class time. And importantly, I'd love to have your suggestions for improving this course. So again, you'll see these little requests for feedback for every single week, and your responses are anonymous. They are not associated with your name, and I will greatly appreciate feedback. Okay, that's all for now.